Hello, and welcome to my first sketchbook tour. This is my Moleskine watercolor sketchbook, and if you look on the product website, it's actually called large size, which is kind of funny because it's very small and portable. And I bought this early summer of 2016, and I bought it particularly for watercolor because I was just starting my watercolor adventures at that time. So what you're seeing are the very beginnings of my understanding of how to use watercolor. And I went to the Denver Botanic Gardens as well as other locations around Denver to practice painting from life and doing plein air painting, and really quickly became totally addicted to it. At first, I was more sketching with the paints rather than actually painting layers, and that's because I just didn't know how yet. I'm a self-taught painter, and it just takes me lots of time and practice to start to get used to a certain medium. Occasionally I would bring it back to my studio and I would do stuff from home, like these are kind of inspired by Lord of the Rings. And for the most part, I loved going to the gardens or out in the wild and working from nature. So I started doing little studies of individual plants and practicing different layering techniques before I ever tried to do like a big landscape scene. And over time, I started to get a little more complex and try different layering techniques. And some of these, I also did a little bit of some micron pen work on it. I also love fantasy style stuff, so you occasionally see some of that mixed in. And I also bought some Derwent Inktense watercolor pencils and did a couple sketches with those. I didn't necessarily enjoy them as much as just painting with my watercolors, but I wanted to give them a try. So this particular spread shows just painting with the pencils themselves, and I never did it again. This was about a month after I had started, and I wanted to do a comparison. So I went back to one of the same places in the Botanic Gardens and sat in the same exact spot and did the same scene. So you can see here the difference. So I was finally getting a better understanding of how to layer the actual pigments and work with more translucent layers to build a more believable scene. So yeah, every day I had time, I would head to the gardens or somewhere outside and do studies. I started to kind of play with a brush pen in some of these, which was really fun. I love that illustrative quality that it has. But for the most part, each day I went out, I tried to focus on a different topic or subject, like how to paint reflective water or shadows, and especially how to layer properly. And here's another comparison that was about a month apart or so. As well as this one. And at this point, I was finally starting to understand that you really need to save the highlights from the very beginning of the painting, and not only understand how to layer and work with a certain amount of water to create a certain look, but that it really made a difference when you worked from light to dark. And occasionally I would do these monochrome studies just to understand values. And then I started to try more and more complex scenes, larger scenes like this. I remember at this point feeling really confused about how to create depth within a scene. So I was trying to choose subjects that had a lot of depth, like these forest scenes, or an object in front of a dense forest, or a close-up object in front of a wide landscape. And of course I had to paint crystals because I just have always loved crystals and gemstones. I live near Red Rocks, so I often went there to sketch, and finally one day decided to bring my paints. I've always loved architectural rendering, and I hope I'll keep getting better with that, but my passion is definitely nature and landscapes. And it was around this time that I really started to embrace that, and I just started bringing my sketchbook everywhere that I went, especially when I went camping and hiking, which was a new experience and completely addicting. So these aspen trees were from a camping trip. And then right before I moved to Scotland, I did one last weekend getaway camping trip in Colorado. And this was one of my favorite weekends of the whole summer. And I love that all of these scenes that I've painted are tied directly to some of my best memories of the last year. If I could permanently be on a camping and hiking trip, I would be so happy, as long as I could paint it along the way. I think another thing that I love about taking my paints with me when I hike and camp is I'm never certain what's going to be around the next corner, and it might be so incredibly inspiring and beautiful. And to capture it with a photograph is great, and it's nice to look back at photos, but to sit down and paint it truly solidifies the awe that I'm in when I'm just sitting in front of this incredible landscape. It somehow is more directly connected to my heart and my spirit, and I internalize it so much deeper. So it kind of goes hand in hand. Art is very personal, and so are the moments that we spend out in nature when we're by ourselves or with friends. There's lots of reflection, and I remember thinking, man, I wish I could share this with someone. And so I just decided to start taking video when I was out painting. And now I have all these little videos from that accompanied paintings in this sketchbook. And what a perfect time to share them when I'm doing a sketchbook tour. Oh, and side note, when I was painting the left side of the sketchbook page, I accidentally dropped my phone when I was about to start recording, and it fell down the rocks into a waterfall. And I very quickly reached down into the pool that it landed in and grabbed it, and all was well. But it was a lesson learned. So now we get into the Scotland pages. This is when I moved to Scotland, and the first week I was there, I did a week-long camping trip. This particular sketch was at the fairy pools in the Isle of Skye, and the Isle of Skye is my all-time favorite location of anywhere I've been in the world. Pretty much anywhere you go on the island is just absolutely breathtaking. And since it was my first week there, being somewhere so incredibly beautiful that I absolutely loved, as well as painting, it just was one of the best memories, and it's a really special page in my sketchbook. Which is, it seems kind of silly to just be so attached to a physical object, but I think this was the time when I was truly starting to completely fall head over heels for watercolor. And of course, I already knew I loved Scotland, but having those things together was incredible. On the next page, I was at the Old Man of Store, which is a really famous and touristy place in Skye, but it was really cool because it was a very misty, rainy day, and I knew we had to paint it since we were there, so we took about an hour to just sit down and enjoy the view, and I sketched and painted for a while before we moved on. This next page was from the opposite facing direction towards the Isle of Raasay, which was really beautiful, and we actually ended up hiking there later. This architecture sketch is from Portree, which is probably the biggest town in Isle of Skye. And the page on the right was from when one of my friends visited and stayed on the Isle of Skye, and we got to hang out with them for a weekend, and this was the view outside of their patio, which was incredible. And so for the winter, I pretty much hibernated. I didn't go out and hike and do plein air painting. So fast forward to about February, this is where we are. The right page was painted first, and these two pages are totally separate, even though they kind of look like they go together. It was in a place called Port Knocky, which was a really cool coastal town facing the ocean. And it was so nice to be out stretching my legs again, painting, and it had a beautiful sunny day, so it was absolutely wonderful. I spent maybe about a half an hour. It was pretty chilly still, so my fingers were kind of numb by the end, but I'm used to that. So I just enjoyed the sunshine and the wind and the sounds of the birds and the waves below the cliff. After being in my studio painting for so many months, it was really nice to be out painting in the wild again, because it truly is my favorite thing. So onto the left page. Once again, I was back in the Isle of Skye, my favorite place, but I was exploring somewhere new. This was near Neast Point, which is a very northerly western area of Skye, and really, really, really incredible any time of year that you go. But the special thing about this painting was that it was my first ever gouache painting. I don't know why it took me so long to try it. I guess I was just super enthralled with watercolor at that point. But I had a set of gouache pan paints, so I put it in my bag and took it with me, and actually found it to be such an awesome medium for doing plein air painting, because it's not as fluid as watercolor, even if you paint with lots of water, the colors kind of stay in place a little easier, and it's just a really wonderful, fast medium to work in. So the next page is kind of a two-story thing. The left side was my first attempt at painting this river. When we got there, it was super sunny and beautiful, and we sat down, almost had like a picnic setup going on. I took my shoes off and everything, and within maybe like 30 seconds to a minute, it started to get cloudy, and not long after that, it started to pour on us. And at first I was like, we can do this, I'm gonna keep painting. And then I started noticing it was destroying my painting. So the left side of the sketchbook page was kind of an example of what happens in a lot of plein air situations. You have no control over the weather, and sometimes you'll arrive somewhere and it's beautiful lighting, beautiful conditions, and before long, maybe the sun goes away, so all your shadows and highlights change, or it starts to actually pour on you or snow on you. So for the most part, standard practice is to do plein air painting, maybe like a quicker sketch or a shorter study, and then take it back to your studio and do a fully rendered painting of that scene, of that landscape. So as you have seen throughout the sketchbook, all of my stuff is very loose and sketchy, and I love that about it. It's like I get to arrive at a spot, a location that I love, get down some paint and really experience it in that way, and then move on. And sometimes I take it back to my studio and do a more fully realized painting, and I absolutely love it. But it at least helps me capture the lighting and the mood and the atmosphere at that time. But yeah, sometimes this happens and you can't always control it. So there's nothing too elaborate about my setup, and it does make it a little bit easier if I do have to run for cover, which we totally had to do here.
It's raining. Actually, I thought it was snowing for a second. Oh my God.
So we ran for cover, and after a few minutes it stopped pouring. The sun came back out, but it was still sprinkling a little, and I'm super stubborn, so I wanted to keep trying to finish the scene. So a few minutes went by and I was like, all right, let's do it. And I kept everything in my bag just in case I had to run again, and just stood there in the same place I was before. But I had to like balance my paints on the right side of the sketchbook, which made it much more difficult. And it was still sprinkling, so my paint was running like crazy, and there were all sorts of weird textures happening. So at this point, I was still kind of like trying to make it look sort of realistic, but having a lot of trouble. But it was a fun experience anyway. After a few minutes of trying to save this painting, I realized that I should just move on. It started to rain again a little bit towards the end of this one as well, and so I was like, dang it. But it was a cool result in the end after it completely dried. So after we took a little break and it stopped raining completely, I went back for another try. And of course, the more practice, the better. Now, onto the final page of the sketchbook, which was actually a really surreal experience because I had been on this watercolor journey since the beginning of the sketchbook. In a way, it was like the end of a chapter. But I already bought another of the same exact sketchbook, and I'm planning on going out very soon and doing more plein air painting. It's just one of my favorite things. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching the process as well as seeing the final result, and I'll be doing more sketchbook tours in the future. Maybe not all quite as elaborate unless you guys like it. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.